So people are like, why? It's weird.
Hello, everybody. It's Ashley.
And Bianca.
And you're listening to Creep It Real. That's it.
Welcome back. And welcome to the family. Mindy from Wisconsin. Phelan from Maryland. I hope I said that right. Sierra from Michigan. And Eliza from Washington.
Yay, welcome to the fam.
We hope you enjoyed our Gettysburg Ghosts episode and the Patreon that went with it. And we also hope that you listened to the Hillbilly Horror Stories Halloween special that we were invited on.
Yeah.
They invited us.
You can tell we get very excited by invites.
And the stories on there are super cool, super creepy. So make sure if you've caught up on us, you also check out those other podcasts and obviously Hillbilly Horror Stories that were on that episode as well, including our good friend Leslie from Because I Want to Know. Today,
well, let's just. I'm just gonna be real here.
Are you gonna creep it real, Ashley?
I'm gonna creep it real, everybody. We are recording in separate spaces today because there is a chance that your old girl has COVID. So I won't know until Saturday, but it's possible and it's quite likely. So we are separated now for the
first time since last year, but it's not like we haven't done it like this before.
Yes,
but
we did.
Still.
Yeah. But so also that said, it may not be like the most normal of recordings that we have done in the past almost year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway. Ooh.
So today we are we're doing something different, and talking about death and the afterlife from a strictly scientific perspective. And we both use the book Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife by Mary Roach.
Oh, it's pretty much what this episode is about, is really just kind of a commentary. I don't know, a discussion about this book in particular with a few odds and ends added to it. And then obviously I have trouble coming from the strictly scientific view because I feel like it's just as narrow-minded as the opposite. So I have to interject with my well here and there.
Mm-hmm. And I don't have a problem with the strictly scientific because that's just the way I think. I'm pretty like, well, what could be the logical reasoning behind this?
Sure, about the things that you choose to be skeptical about, but then there are other things in which you're like, oh, wait a second.
Yeah. That's true.
It kind of like everybody. We all kind of have our own
pick and choose.
Yeah, our own things that we are more easily believing than the other thing. So, anyway, I had to add that because it's true.
So, of course, we also did additional internet research, and I think we both read some of the articles that were included in the book by the scientists that we will be discussing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That go hand in hand with the commentary that Mary Roach wrote about.
So we're going to begin speaking about reincarnation. Dating back to AD 500, the Ordinances of Manu, a tome of legal code based on Vedic scripture, covered everything from criminal law to reincarnation. In Manu's day, reincarnation wasn't thought of as some abstract religious principle, but was rather a solid legal consequence. As is stated in Witness Code 66 of Chapter 7, one becomes indeed a kind of heron by stealing fire, a hose wasp by stealing a house utensil. By stealing dyed cloths, one is born again as a fowl called jivijak something. I can't say that word. There's too many consonants.
There's too many dots in that. I can't.
It's anyway, you're by stealing dyed cloth, you're born as a fowl and so on. One of the worst reincarnation punishments is that of the Brahmin who has deserted his own proper rules of right, who must reincarnate as the ghost Okamuka, an eater of vomit.
Yuck.
So that's everybody that goes around eating American chocolate, by the way. because I'm a chocolate snob.
You're so pretentious with chocolate. I didn't know
So
that.
author Mary Roach spent a week with Kirti Rawat, director of the International Center for Survival and Reincarnation researches in India. And when we say survival, we mean survival of the soul. These researchers, 6 to 7 of them, believe that reincarnation is something beyond the realm of metaphor and religious precept, and take very seriously the claims of young children who talk about people and events from a previous life. They travel to the child's home, both in this life and, if possible, the alleged past life, interviewing family members and witnesses. They catalog evidence and discrepancies and try to understand what the hell is going on with the phenomena. While these are very educated academic individuals, they are obviously delving into territory that the scientific community ignores, and in the worst cases actually condemns. The cases are obviously much higher in places where reincarnation is part of the belief system. On the contrary, in the United States, where only about 25% of people believe in reincarnation, according to a 2001 Gallup poll, cases of reincarnation in children is much more rare. Obviously, this makes the cases that do pop up in cultures where reincarnation isn't widely believed more credible, at least you would think. For example, in Western culture, if a child begins talking about a stranger with an unfamiliar name and information, parents will typically assume it's an imaginary friend, whereas in cultures where it is ingrained in the belief system that they are reincarnated, they will more quickly assume it's someone from the child's past life. Obviously, that tends to color the situation quite a bit. And obviously this raises a valid question of if cases are solved or are they actually built. Does the acceptance and encouragement from the child's parents simply foster a situation where a child feels like they can relay all the memories, whereas in Western culture they may feel ignored or like it's abnormal and thus discouraged from doing so altogether? That said, the researchers performed their work as methodically and thoroughly as any good police detective would on their tireless search for independently verifiable facts. First, they contact the parents of the child and travel to their home to interview them, where they ask them for their exact account of what happened, verbatim, all about when and what the child began talking about when they started telling of things that clearly didn't respond to their current life. They also interview any and all witnesses to the child's story and utterances as well. By the point that they arrive on the scene, the family typically has gotten a pretty good idea about who the person may have been in their past life. And that's sometimes where I'm like, well, it's so easy to find them out. I find that a little bit hard to believe. And so the researchers then go to interview the deceased person's family. If they recall details of their home, features of their town, or members of their family, the researchers interview any witnesses who saw what these children are saying, that they could actually confirm that this is how the house looked or this is how the town looked. The strongest cases are the ones where the parents wrote down the child's statements when they very first began talking about the past life and before they met any of the people that are associated with that life. For the record, this was rare in the doctor that we're going to speak about shortly, Stevenson's research. He said out of the 800 cases that he investigated in his career, only 20 people had actually written down their children's statements from the beginning of the statement. The rest of the 780, it was like months later, weeks later, years later. And as we'll talk about, and we've already talked about in other cases, obviously, the written record makes for much more solid evidence than the parents' memories of what their child said. We've spoken on memories and how certain details can shift within less than an hour of recalling an incident, so we know human memory is deeply fallible. It can be affected by emotions, a person's beliefs, desires, and may not always take into account all the facts of the situation. Furthermore, could the parents be reinterpreting different details and filling gaps after learning about the alleged past life story? I think so, and I think We'll see how that's going to be the case. For example, can the parent be completely sure that their child spoke of their past life first, or was it after hearing the parent speak on some of the information and then they simply repeated it? I believe this can explain some of the cases, but it definitely can't be said across the board, and that's going to be repeated about 1 million times during this episode.
Because I've read of like past life children remembering past lives here in the United States, where obviously it's less prevalent and, kids think or kids will know things about being a pilot, or they will have been, I specifically know the pilot in a past life. And they'll know things about being a pilot. No, but they'll know things about like what mechanisms are on a plane and like how to actually fly an airplane and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Where you could really it seems to be just absolutely impossible that kid is seriously just gleaning this information from conversations they've heard from their parents or something.
Or even something from like the History Channel or something like that. Anyways.
Yeah. Yes, agreed. These researchers aren't alone. Dr. Ian Stevenson spent the past 30 years investigating over 800 cases of this very phenomena while serving as a tenured professor at the University of Virginia and as a contributor to peer-reviewed publications. The University of Virginia Press has published 4 volumes of his reincarnation case studies, and Prager Publishing recently released Stevenson's 2,000-page opus, Biology and Reincarnation. Most of Stevenson's case records include a chart for each case summarizing the allegedly reborn child's statements about their past life and the people that they recognize. For each of these statements and recognitions, Stevenson lists a witness, if one exists, and their comments on the matter. Most of these charts go on for 8 to 10 pages with names and statements corroborating the stories in increasingly tiny type. Kind of like the John Mulaney happy birthday sign is what I thought of. Skeptic.
I love him.
I know, he's so funny. Skeptics tend to dismiss him on the whole without looking at things on a case-by-case basis. One did try to do just that, Professor Leonard Angel at Douglas College in British Columbia, who chose the case of a Druze boy from Lebanon named Ahmad Elawar, a case Stevenson has referred to as one of his strongest. This is the only case which includes a written record in which Stevenson himself transcribed the notes, preventing an inaccurate after-the-fact recollection. But then again, they could have just been inaccurately recollecting to
Remembered. Yeah.
Angel complained that Stevenson never made it known that the statements were initially worded by the boy or parents, and that he simply wrote the parents believed the boy to have been one Mahmoud Bouamzi of Kribi. I mean, Jesus Christ. Okay. Of Kribi, who had a wife called Jamala, which were the names the boy first spoke of and spoke of most often. This man had been fatally injured by a truck after a fight with the driver, so the boy said. Stevenson traveled with the family for their first trip to Kribi, and he was unable to find a match for Mahmoud Bouhamzi he felt could be the child's past identity, but was able to locate an Ibrahim Bouhamzi with a mistress named Jamila. Ibrahim was not run over by a truck, though his relative Saeed was, though there was no quarrel involved in the situation.
It's honestly, it sounds like this kid heard this story from somebody and got everything mixed up.
It's quite possible because it's literally like a town over. So,
right.
Yeah. Stevenson concluded that the parents had made inferences based on his words, but considering that his write-up didn't give the boy's exact words, it's difficult to know really what happened here and what to think about it. Discovering Stevenson's work is what drew Roach to this subject altogether and made her think about it with any credence. After contacting Stevenson, who is now in his 80s, he directed her to some of his colleagues in India, and she eventually would go to India to investigate a case. And it was of a boy named Ashwari that was living in the town of Chandar, 3 hours from Delhi. At 3 years old, Ashwari began talking about people from a prior existence. In Stevenson's research, 95% of the children began talking about their previous existences between the ages of 2 and 4, and then began to forget about it altogether by the time they were around 5 years old. So it was a very short-lived situation. This was typical. He described the, quote, sudden violent death of the previous personality, where it just does not even remotely register to them anymore at all. Ashwari's family thought him to be the reincarnation of a factory worker named Virpal from several villages away who accidentally electrocuted himself shortly before Ashwari was born. His father, Mooney, claims that the boy recognized Veerpal's uncles and aunts when they came to Chadner and could name many of the people in Veerpal's photo albums. Further, he said the boy claimed to have 3 kids and family living in Kamalapur, and that his caste was Lode, all of which accurately describe Veerpal. And I sound like an absolute idiot to anyone from India.
Don't.
Yes, I do.
I will too when I speak about Dutch people, so don't even worry about it.
When Mooney went to Veerpal's widow and gave her a sari as a gift, it is said that Ashwari insisted that the sari be turquoise, which was a color that Rani, Veerpal's widow, later told the family that Veerpal used to buy her saris in that exact color, which could have been a coincidence.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of turquoise saris going around, but
yeah.
Who knows? Mooney also reported seeing Ashwari hitting an electrical pole with a stick and calling it abusive names. I guess he was pissed thinking about how he got electrocuted. just a kid hitting a electrical cord and calling it an idiot. You stupid piece of shit. Ashwari's mother, Ramvati, said she saw her son trying to kiss Rani on the lips and at one point spotted him caressing her breast.
That makes me uncomfortable.
It does make me uncomfortable too, but I'm also thinking, I've known some young children, little boys, to be a little obsessed with the tits, you know?
Well, and then also, is it like a milk situation? I don't know. I don't see little boys very frequently. And I've never had little boys do that to me either. But
but I've seen it. I've seen it. Ashwari has attended his, or technically Veerpal's son's, birthday party, and in a photograph that was taken of him and Veerpal's widow, who is 26 years old, the 4-year-old boy is staring at her very fondly and what some have called even lustfully, and his alleged past wife. And Dr. Rawat explained that this kind of sexual precociousness is not incredibly common, but it is also not unheard of as a byproduct of the reincarnation cases. He told Roach, "That is nothing. I heard of a case where a husband said to his wife, 'When I die, I will come back as your son and I won't take milk from your breast.' And sure enough, the husband later died during his wife's pregnancy, and the infant son born months later refused to breastfeed." Not that that is necessarily proof of anything, but in this case, it was said that she was both his mother and his wife, which is pretty fucked up.
Bullshit.
Yes. It's pretty fucked up, but like Mary Roach says, it's pretty much what all men want anyway, and I kind of have to agree. At some deep level, it's gross, but it's true. So, Dr. Rawat sat with Ashwari and showed him the photographs of the birthday the month prior, asking, "Who's this?" To which the boy replied, "This is my son." But other photos are difficult for him to identify. Even a picture of Veerpal is met with confusion. Rawat responds that he doesn't seem to remember as much now. It's like his memory is fading, perhaps. Mooney tells them that his son walked up to a boy in Veerpal's town and said to him, "Your parents came to see me in the hospital," and the boy's parents confirmed that they had gone to see Veerpal after the accident. Mooney adds that while playing with Veerpal's aunt, Ashwari said to her, "Auntie, you have not left your old habits," which was said to be the exact wording of a phrase that Veerpal used to say. But later, when interviewing the aunt, she says that while it's true that Ashwari used that phrase with her, it was not something that Veerpal ever said. The family, though, was claiming that to be the case. So it's just one of those things where it's like they're grabbing on to things and just making a story out of it.
Yeah. It's like seeing Jesus in toast.
Yes. Subsequently, in a conversation with Veerpal's uncle, Gajraj, who says he was returning home from his work as a school teacher one evening when a large crowd had gathered saying that Veerpal was back, something he did not think was possible considering that he had died. He claimed the boy didn't seem to recognize anyone initially, but whispered the name of one of his close friends and said he was his uncle, but identified him as his uncle, but that the man seemed slightly influenced by the situation when he was answering the questions from Dr. Rawat and was likely filling in some gaps to make the story fit.
Sure.
Later still, when asked if he believed the boy was Veerpal, another uncle looked very uncomfortable and told Mary Roach, "I can't say." It's almost like it's worse that he wouldn't be, because now they're so happy that he is back.
That it would be him, yeah.
Much of this suggests that while the boy and his parents seem to believe the story, which given the culture is not surprising, not everyone in the deceased person's family is so easily convinced. And I think that would be understandable for anybody.
Sure, of course.
In another case in Chadner, a Hindu boy who recalled a past life as there was a Hindu boy who recalled a past life as a Muslim, and he remembered the process of circumcision and was also born with a penis without foreskin, which they said in the book, they were like, could his penis circumstance have inspired his or his parents' imagination? Perhaps to say that something like this had happened, and then I don't know. It's just stories, they're just yeah. Who knows? Interviewing the boy. Well, okay, go.
Sorry, what I was gonna say is that in that particular paragraph too, they had mentioned like it's pretty common for people within the Hindu religion to, as children at least, to remember their past lives as a different religion of some sort. Mm-hmm. But it's not as common, obviously, as you said before, for somebody who was Muslim or Christian to say, I remember this past life, and it would be much more compelling.
Yeah.
Were that to be the case,
right.
And they weren't influenced by their religion from the outset.
Yeah. Of course, though, are we not that I am Christian, but as a Christian, more society, are we influenced by that to not believe things of any sort of supernatural or paranormal nature, and then does that affect what we are able to see, or I don't know.
I feel like reincarnation could be like the most, it has the most credence to me, just because, the whole energy cannot be created, cannot be destroyed situation. Like
what happens?
What happens to that energy?
Yeah.
What happens to it? So to me, I'm like, well, if that's the case, this would be the most logical thing, but I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. So none of us, nobody will know.
That's pretty much the theme of this episode, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So in cultures where reincarnation is part of the belief system, congenital abnormalities are commonly viewed as clues to the child's past life, often being tied to the death of the alleged person that they previously were. Ian Stevenson's Reincarnation in Biology contains 10 cases of children with birthmarks or birth defects that correspond to the area on their body where they were shot or fatally wounded. These birthmark beliefs go a ways back in history. A somewhat surprising majority of 16th and 17th century physicians believed that a child's abnormalities or birthmarks were caused by the mother having undergone a memorable fright during her pregnancy, i.e.
Of course, always.
It's always the mother's fault.
It's always the mom's fault.
You can't win. A baby born without an arm, the mother recalls being accosted by a one-armed beggar, or a child born with ichthyosis or fish scales, blamed on a mother's fear of serpents and stuff like that.
Girl.
I know. It's ridiculous. Reports of maternal impressions were included in medical texts from Hippocrates all the way to the 1903 edition of the American Textbook of Obstetrics, which cites maternal impressions as the likely cause of John Merrick, otherwise known as Elephant Man's deformities, of course. In Reincarnation in Biology, Stevenson proposes that perhaps the mother saw the corpse of the dead man whose soul eventually turns up in her unborn child. Though he doesn't believe that all birthmarks are caused by maternal impression, he is open-minded to the possibility that some are, and fine, sure. Those who subscribe to the maternal impression theory believe that the skin is uniquely vulnerable to emotional imprinting. Stevenson describes over 6 dermatological conditions thought to be open to psychological influence, from emotionally induced blisters to the less easy to believe stigmata and wart charming, which I had never heard of before, but it's an ancient tradition using magic to transfer warts onto another being or object. Very interesting. Stevens says that genetics and environmental influences fall short of thoroughly explaining the quirks and foibles of the previous personality to explain what genetics doesn't. But that said, how does one's being, their skills, preferences, fears, beliefs, transfer to a new organism if not through genetics? Further, if we pick out all a child's unique traits and list them out side by side with a supposed former life, you're probably bound to match up a few of them in the long run.
Of course.
Many of the cases in Stevenson's collection seem dubious at best. When the villages in a region all look very similar, with very similar characteristics, and the floor was stone slabs, and the family had cows and oxen, the house had 2 rooms. It could apply to 15 different houses in a village. The significance is slightly lost. There might have been a hole in the ground in which we shit. When Mary Roach asked Dr. Raway why the human spirit seems to be such a homebody, he shrugged and responds, "You are more comfortable in your own surroundings. You fit in well again." Which I guess makes sense, but I was wondering that same thing is, why does it seem like reincarnation happens like in a localized situation, you know? It's kind of interesting.
And that's why I'm like, the people who talk about their past lives across the world and they know exactly where something is located and they can go to the place and say, it's right up there. I know that person. That's blah, blah, blah. That's so much more compelling than somebody who's the child of somebody who lives a mile up the road.
Yes. However, there are definitely many statements that are incredibly specific, and they do defy any logical, like you just say, like they defy logical explanation. How does a soul or a spirit travel to infuse itself into a clump of cells multiplying on a uterus wall? Philosophers and scientists long ago called this moment of soul transference ensoulment and debated it for centuries, and still we have no idea. But I will say, and I don't know if I talk about it or not, but I will say that I've been like seeing various things lately about how personality and preferences and certain and traits of personalities can be transferred with like organs and things like that, and it makes it it makes me very curious about where are these things actually imprinted? And is it something in our DNA or is it something beyond that? Because we really don't know. But I mean, I saw like a scientific article talking about how transplants are somehow transplanting aspects of certain the dead person or whoever had given the transplant to the transplantee, the donor. The donor. They are acquiring skills they didn't have before, memories of things, like just all sorts of things that just defy logic.
So speaking of the soul, the spirit in the days of Aristotle was believed to be a kind of vapor or breath, and Aristotle called the spirit the pneuma. He believed that the pneuma was carried in the semen and was central to the creation of life, and that it took 7 days to set after it arrived in the uterus.
Okay.
I wish you could see my air quotes, everybody.
All right.
Because it just arrives. Hello, I'm here now.
I don't know how I got here.
And the pneuma would infuse the uterus with one of 3 eventual souls.
Oh.
The vegetative soul was a starter because it's bread. It's sourdough bread, I guess.
Yeah.
And on the 40th day after conception, the human morphed into a sensitive soul that related to the senses.
Okay.
And after some other unspecified amount of time, the soul upgraded to a rational soul.
So do we lose the sensitivity or?
I guess. Okay. I think it just morphs and like evolves.
Okay. It's building on the sensitivity.
It builds on itself, yeah. So this is what people believed for about 2,000 years after Aristotle initially made...
The world's only been around for 2,000 years, Bianca.
That's true. I'm so sorry.
Get your timeline right.
I know. I'm so sorry. After Aristotle initially made these claims, until William Harvey figured out that blood circulates in a closed system of arteries and veins. But he didn't study women. He instead dissected deer.
Okay.
I mean, that's great. Mm-hmm. But I think also maybe we should have gotten female cadavers, but that's fine. Whatever.
Yeah.
So he started dissecting deer, and in this female deer that he dissected, instead of finding what he thought was going to be a coagulated blob, he found the embryos of baby deer.
Okay.
And as opposed to continue to use science to see why, he asked himself, how would the life force get into the egg? And he came up with a conclusion that It is given by the heavens of the sun or the Almighty Creator.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was, of course, crippled by the fact that they had no equipment to do further research on a cellular level. Although, would he do that or would he fall back on religion? He'd probably fall back on religion.
Yeah.
And so he, of course, couldn't see the sperm.
Mm-hmm.
Anthony van Leeuwenhoek was a Dutch accountant for a haberdasher, or a men's clothier, and the chamberlain of the council chamber of the worshipful sheriffs of Delft.
Okay.
Which means that he was a chamber tidier.
Okay. Oh, God. What is happening right now?
This allowed him plenty of time for his hobby of grinding lenses and building microscopes, which were actually better than those of the main microscope maker of the day. And his microscopes soon became the hot commodity and in demand by members of the Royal Society of London for the improvement of natural knowledge. In 1675, he discovered bacteria and protozoa in drops of stagnant water in a water butt in his backyard.
Water butt?
He named...
I don't know. I can't think of anything. I can't. I was going to make a joke and my brain is not working. Okay.
He named this discover animalcules.
Oh.
So then he used the microscope and wrote in one of his journals, "My teeth are not so cleaned, but what there sticketh and groweth between some of my front ones and my grinders, a little white matter, which is thick as if it were batter."
I am not well enough for that.
So he mixed his batter with
His
fresh
teeth batter.
rainwater. No.
Oh, his semen?
Yes.
Oh. I thought he was talking about that he had teeth fuzz and he was scraping it off into
between. No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
What is this between my front ones and my grinders? I thought that was teeth.
Oh. Huh. Maybe. Wow.
Okay, so honestly though, I would rather that he
Be
had
semen?
spread semen in a dish instead of scraping the dirty teeth film off of his front teeth.
Wait, no. It is his semen.
Okay. Well, good.
So
I'm less gaggy about that.
So he mixed his batter with fresh rainwater and looked at it under the microscope and found animalcules.
Okay.
He didn't want to do that any longer, though, because it's, improper. And he went back to oral bacteria. So when he did further research, he asked his wife and daughter for some plaque between their teeth. And then he asked an old man who he said had never washed his mouth in all of his life for a sample.
Come on.
Yeah. What he found was that his daughter and wife had a normal number of animalcules, while the old man held, quote, an unbelievably great company of living animalcules.
There is a fucking society in there.
And thankfully, this caused the foundations of oral hygiene to begin taking shape.
Okay.
Back to the semen situation, though.
Okay, thank goodness.
Of course, the men at the Royal Society were polite and attentive to his oral investigations, but they were particularly encouraging of his examinations regarding his semen because they were still under the impression that they could probably view the human soul within the semen.
As most men probably still hold that belief.
However interested in viewing the material of the human soul the Royal Society were, he refused, questioning the decorum of writing about semen and intercourse. Several years later, a student gave him a vial of semen from a man with gonorrhea, within which the student said he'd found small animals with tails, which were assumed to be attributed to the gonorrhea.
There's goblins in there.
However, Leeuwenhoek suspected otherwise and decided to examine his own, but he was adamant about the fact that the material he used for himself was a, quote, residue after conjugal coitus, and not the product of sinfully defiling himself.
Wait, a second. How dare
Give me
you?
a break.
How dare you speak about masturbation that way? God damn it.
His study of sperm described their shape, their movement, their size, etc., all of which is true. But then he claimed, here's where he goes wrong. Mm-hmm. He claimed to see a network of vessels within the sperm bodies and imagined that it held the beginnings of all the organs the humans would someday possess, thus creating the belief of preformationism.
Like they were like little miniatures just sitting around, floating around? Okay. Okay.
Literally, in like old textbooks, it's like a picture of sperm and like a little man in there.
It's kind of like that picture of a body with the skeleton trying to break free. Do you know what I'm talking about?
That's what it is, yeah, but it's a little sperm.
Oh my god. This is the worst thing I've ever heard.
So he never managed to fully find these preformed people inside the sperm, shockingly. But he believed each sperm held a soul within the potential to become human life, and that the woman's role within the reproduction of humans was just to receive and nourish the already perfectly formed human.
And if it's fucked up, it's your fault because you didn't do your
You didn't nourish
part.
it right.
Yeah, right.
Leeuwenhoek became known as a spermist, and there was a slew of disinformation and theories surrounding sperm. Some thought it was like an animal, and people believed that it ate and really did all of the functions of an animal, going so far as to even illustrate a digestive system of a sperm cell.
I hope not, because I've consumed some fucking live beings in my time. They're just in there hanging out still. They have a bar going.
Some people thought that the sperm had nothing to do with reproduction and was a symptom of a disease of the testicle.
God, at least they got a little bit of grief for once.
Others, though, thought that it was the sperm's job to make men want to have sex by causing itching. I'm not a man, but I feel like these men are acting like men who are pretending to have no idea what being horny is like. Like everybody's in on it, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's I think what it is," and like
that's like have you ever touched a boob? It's like a bag of sand on 40-Year-Old Virgin.
Yeah.
That's pretty much exactly what's going on here.
So they're all in it together because, God forbid, we feel the human emotion of lust in a non-reproductive way. You know what I mean?
Oh no.
Oscar Hertwig, a German embryologist and cytologist, and the first to recognize that the fusion of the nuclei of the sperm and ovum was essential in fertilization, came along and discovered conception.
Oh, that magical situation.
Then the question came back and was, when does the soul enter?
Okay.
So it came back. When is the soul in the body?
Well, we don't even know if there really is one.
Exactly.
But okay.
And of course, this brings the morality of abortion up, because when does the soul?
Well, to be honest, I feel like that almost makes it less of a big deal, because your soul is going to go on, do something somewhere eventually anyway.
True. I didn't ever think of it that way. Sure.
I don't know. It depends on what your ideas are.
So Norman Ford, who was or is, I don't know, a moral philosopher and Catholic priest, said in his book...
Interesting dichotomy there.
Moral philosopher and Catholic priest?
Yeah, okay.
He said in his book, When Did I Begin?, that personhood cannot begin until after the point where identical twinning is possible, about 14 days after conception, determining that if the soul arrived at conception, at the point the zygote is split in two, the soul would also split in two, causing pain.
Okay. And a split soul. Split pea soul.
Mm-hmm. Right. So still, no one knows at which point the soul is instilled within a person, or really what process happens to get itself in the person, or where it's located, or if it exists, or anything.
Yeah. It's not too clear.
One of René Descartes, who is a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, lesser known projects was to figure out the inner workings of humans. He would purchase carcasses looking for a soul and assumed it was somewhere in the brain, eventually chalking up to the pineal gland because of the gland's position at the center of the head and the fact that it is a singular structure within the brain, but the pineal gland actually regulates melatonin production, so that's not it.
Yeah.
He didn't think that the gland was the soul itself, but rather a meeting point for sensory information, and the streams of spiritus then carried out the self's higher functions. It itself is like a little bar, a little hub where it all meets.
Okay. All right.
The Midrash, which is an ancient rabbinical commentary of the Torah, references an indestructible bone called the lus. It's shaped like a chickpea or an almond, depending on who you ask, and is at either the top or the bottom of the spine. Oh. Again, depending on who you ask.
Okay.
Yeah. Possible bones that they have found include the coccyx. Can't be that one. My abusive ex fractured mine.
Oh, dear.
The sacrum, the 12th vertebra, bones of the skull, and bones of the big toe. Of course, all of which are easily destroyed. Mm-hmm. Herophilius in the 3rd century BC dissected human cadavers and discovered the 4 ventricles of the brain, believing that the soul was in the 4th. He was actually also rumored to have dissected live humans as well, vivisecting hundreds of criminals.
Oh, dear.
Then there was Viennese physician Franz Joseph Gall. And while he was able to pinpoint the language center of the brain and the memory center for words, he's best known as the founder of the extremely accurate science of phrenology, and also claimed to have located 27 organs of the human brain corresponding to a specific trait.
What? What do you mean,
what?
27 organs of the human brain?
Yeah, all of the brain, like the brain has 27 organs, and everything corresponds to a specific trait. Like, have you seen Django?
Yeah.
Where he says that the little divot in the skull is for submissiveness.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
That's like, there's different traits.
Okay. All right. Mm-hmm.
Because of the rapid decay of brains, he began studying skulls themselves and reasoned that if an organ of the brain was particularly well developed, it would produce a bump in the skull. Gall's era was the beginning of the end of the search for the soul in anatomy and neurology, and was from then on believed to reside within the realms of religion, parapsychology, and philosophy. No shit.
Yeah, probably best. For the best.
So, the weight of the soul was also something that has been discussed. There's Duncan McDougall, and I'm sure in the beginning you're like, oh, when Ashley was like, well, we don't even know if the soul exists. Duncan McDougall is the person who performed the 21 grams experiment. He was a well-respected surgeon and physician from Haverhill, Massachusetts, and he hypothesized that souls have physical weight, and he attempted to measure the mass change of 6 patients at the moment of death. 6 patients.
Okay.
Not 100, just 6.
That's a small circumcise?
What?
That's a small subject size. What is that? Test subject?
Yeah.
Yes.
So 1 of the 6 lost 21.3 grams.
Okay.
Because of the small sample size, the methods used, and the fact that only 1 of only 6 subjects met his hypothesis, his experiment is widely regarded as flawed and unscientific.
Why, though?
Because there was 6.
Yeah. I could do that study within a room with when I go to your house.
Exactly. And the case has also been cited as an example of selective reporting.
No shit.
Dubious MDs criticized the experiment, pointing out that the sphincter and pelvic floor muscles relax at death, and the loss could have been flatulence, could have been urine, could have been feces.
I sure hope,
literally anything.
I sure hope if they had shit their guts out at death that he would have taken that into account and not just been like, it was definitely the soul, never mind all that on the ground there. Let's just chalk it up to the soul.
However, the most likely determination of the loss of 21 grams in that one patient out of the 6 patients was insensible loss. That body weight is continually being lost through evaporating perspiration and water vapor in one's breath.
Well, look at that, you guys. If you're trying to lose 20 pounds, just die. There you go.
You got 21 grams.
There you go. Oh, grams. Okay, fine. A pound.
Not even.
I'm thinking about ounces.
Not even an ounce.
Oh my God. What a nightmare. 21 grams isn't even enough weed to last me a day. JK about that.
She's not.
I am.
So insensible weight loss was coined by Sanctorius in the year of 1690. He was the founding father of metabolic balance studies. So it's kind of a gross method that he developed, so I don't know if you want to hear it.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So he had an experimental scale, which had a platform and a bench in the center with a hole cut out. He'd sit himself on the platform, he'd eat a meal, and then he'd sit on it for 8 hours, after which he'd
Poop.
go. Yeah. And when the time came, he found that a small portion of the food weight remained unaccounted for, which he attributed to sweat and breath vapor, naming it insensible perspiration.
Maybe it was like, what about the food that you actually digest and like retain the nutrients and
yeah,
liquid? Okay. All right, you guys in the 1600s, 1700s, you were just trying.
Get it together.
You were trying to make your way. I get it. You don't know shit. Okay, so in 1911, after Duncan MacDougall felt pretty confident that he had proven the existence of the soul by weighing it, he needed then to actually see it. As he explained in a newspaper article from earlier that year, he needed to know what color the soul was and how large it was in relation to the body. He wanted to see what route it took as it exited the body. Did it escape from the heart, the top of the head, the mouth? Where was it? In his pursuit to find this out, he steadily ignored the growing disapproval of the hospital and asylum boards regarding the patients from which he drew his pool of human lab mice. He had the dying men that he chose lay on ordinary beds in a darkened room, and at the, quote, supreme moment, he aimed a strong beam of light along the length of the patient's body, first using a swath of white light, then experimenting with the individual colors of the spectrum, using a long glass prism to separate the bands of light, first trying with the spectrum horizontal and then vertical, and guess what? He didn't detect a damn thing.
Oh, that's crazy. Oh, my gosh.
He came to the conclusion that the soul's index of refraction is 0, and being that all substances except the ether of space give some refraction of light, the soul had to be made of ether. Side note, pre-Einstein, ether was an accepted concept in physics, which was thought to be the medium for the transmission of electromagnetic waves, like sound, light, and radio. It was invisible, undetectable, and permeated all forms of matter, human to furniture. But ether was also thought to be weightless, which put a bit of a stain on MacDougall's theory. But he did not want to completely abandon it, so he came up with a new theory, which I find funny. He's like, wait, this doesn't fit, so which I guess is what you always do, but it's also just like, for his little situation, it's like, okay, MacDougall, you're like, wait a second,
right.
I just disproved myself, so let me amend that. So he was wondering
It's like flat earthers.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. And like police that go in with one idea, and they try to make all the evidence fit that
Exactly.
idea. Like the suicide episode of Unsolved Mysteries that recently came out, where the cops were just like, she committed suicide, even though it makes no sense. Probably. Right. Anyway, so he was wondering if ether and souls were subject to the laws of gravity, because if they were not, for as long as humans have been around, their souls were just floating out into space, just littering the place, which made the idea of an orderly afterlife somewhat out of the realm of comprehension. In the same vein, if a person's soul was separated from their spiritual body by such a great distance, it would be quite an unfortunate situation. And so he propositioned a giant Earth-accompanying globe of ether above the storm zone, acting as a floating reunion cloud just outside Earth's atmosphere. Something he did not publish in any medical journal, but instead in an article for 1914's Boston Sunday Post titled, "Heaven is perhaps just outside Earth." So he just was acting like we all just floated into this little ozone zone, essentially. And met all our dead friends and family, and we just hang out up there forever. So although many attempts were made to capture the soul light escaping a dying human body, it never happened for McDougall. Hereward Carrington, PhD and founder of the Psychic Laboratory, had an even more creative approach to soul viewing. In his 1930 book, The Story of Psychic Science, he proposed his idea for a machine which would reveal the shape of the soul. Which, like, who gives a shit what the shape of the soul is? Or color,
It doesn't,
even.
like, let's figure out if there is one first. Why don't we do that? Let's do that first.
I guess they're trying to do that, but it just doesn't, who cares? The instructions were as follows. Arrange a small box as to imprison some animal, a dog, cat, or small monkey. Then he goes into hermetic seals, piped in anesthetic, dust-free air, ionization rays, an air pump, and he ends with, therefore, when condensation occurs, the resulting line will outline the form of the astral body, which is very scientific. Doctor, way to go. That said, he never even built this monkey soul tracer, so I don't know what kind of LSD he dropped before coming up with that idea. It was never even put to the test to begin with. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess you're just trying anything. You're just like,
you know what? This kind of reminds me of like those memes where it's like 8-year-old me mixing potions in the bathroom, and it's like soap and conditioner and like shampoo, and it's just like mouthwash. You know what I'm talking about? Where like it's just throwing anything together to see if it's going to be a potion or if it's going to work scientifically.
I mean, I guess, and I think they must have been kind of fucked up sometimes. Like this guy had to have been. A pair of Dutch physicists, J.L.W.P. Matla and G.J. Zalberg van Zelst, believed they were in contact with an entity that spoke to them letter by letter on a Ouija board. The entity told Matla that the human spirit survives death to become a gaseous body called Om Force, meaning man force, and he reasoned that if this Om Force truly was a gas, it must obey laws of physics, and thus its existence could possibly be scientifically proven. The entity agreed with Matla, and as Roach put it, it appeared to have an engineering background and gave the men detailed instructions for the building of a device that could perform this task.
Crazy. So crazy how they have like how they're so similar.
I don't understand. And so in seance number 36, they were told, construct 2 cardboard cylinders that are impenetrable to air. The length should be 50 centimeters, diameter 25. The idea being that the gaseous entity would pass into these cylinders and make its presence known by expanding and contracting on demand. And I'm wondering if this is where Ghostbusters got its little ghost pack idea, where you trap the ghost in that little thing. But probably not, because this is dumb. Then the displaced air would cause a drop of grain alcohol in a glass tube to rise and fall. And according to Matla, this happened to his satisfaction, though he obviously had a lot to gain from it going well.
Of course he did. It's so crazy how that just correlates.
It happened for him. The pair expounded further and further with their ideas, growing even more detailed as they went. Hereward Carrington couldn't help but try building his own cylinders, his done up just a little more fancy and rigged with a bell that would ring when the alcohol drop moved. He would assemble groups of observers and prompt any force capable of moving the drop to do so, and it was said that sometimes it did, many times it didn't, and almost always it didn't really seem to have anything to do with the requests for it to do so. It was completely unrelated.
Right.
Often it was said to happen once Carrington would give up and leave the room, almost as if there was a spirit purposefully toying with him and trying to make him look like a fool. Almost like a trickster.
Almost like it's random.
Maybe. Or almost like it's completely random and has nothing to do with anything. He would go on to spend an entire year experimenting with these cylinders, and in the end concluded that coincidence and temperature changes accounted for Matla's results. Shocking.
Crazy.
I know. Although today...
A whole year.
A whole year. But I mean, I guess he got paid for it. Although today these are fringe as fuck scientists, for some time, paranormal research was an acceptable undertaking among some respected scientists, as was evidenced by an article from 1921 in Lancet, now one of the most respected medical journals in the world. Dr. Charles Russ wrote that he had proven the existence of an unknown force or ray that emerges from the human eye, and he built a tabletop device to demonstrate this force, which was illustrated in the article. Volunteers were asked to stare into a sealed box of copper wire coil suspended from a string and held steady by a magnetic force. He claimed if they stared at the left side, it would push the coil clockwise, and staring at the right would make it twist in the opposite direction. He proposed that this mystery force, quote, disturbs the electrostatic state of the enclosed system, and said that 5 physicists at London's Royal Society were unable to find electrical or mechanical error that could explain the effects. Yet again, beyond his own experiments, no one recreated this box since that happened. So who knows if it had any validity whatsoever, or if he was just getting fucked up on some laudanum and got a little wild with his experiments. That said, Dr. Russ was one in a long line of scientists who were sure that the soul was some kind of life force that may not be able to be photographed or actually located, but could be then detected and proved indirectly through its emanations, which were typically captured as a glowing crown or lightning-esque rays around the edges of living objects which were in contact with photosensitive surfaces. But photography was in its infancy, and much of the non-fraudulent captures that they got back then were just straight-up misguided user error, as you might expect.
Wow.
I know. Chemist and soul photo debunker Emil Jacobin dedicated himself to debunking various quote-unquote paranormal photos, including his attempt to destroy the electrograph, which was a device used for etching or transfer of pictures or designs by electrolytic means, or documenting the form and electrical discharge given off by an object, living or dead or inert, that has been hooked up to an induction machine and put on photosensitive surface. I have no idea what I just said. In one...
sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I mean, I have no idea. In one instance, reproducing a famous paranormal photographer's photograph, he named it Electrograph of the Antipathy Between Two Vienna Sausages, as he was mocking a picture that scientists had paraded of two adversaries holding their fingertips together, accompanying an article that this technique could be used not only to photograph life force, but also to diagnose illnesses and emotional states. So they would take a picture, and then if there was like some light coming out of your head because they fucked up in processing, they were like, you have
a life force.
You have what is the hysteric? I don't know what I'm saying. They're just diagnosing people based off of their photo errors, which is, slightly troubling. Slightly troubling.
Yeah, of course.
Let's move on to spiritualism. Okay. To put it in a TLDR form, spiritualism is a religious movement devoted to communicating with the dead via mediums and proving it to others via seances and other demonstrations using mediums, that it's possible that you can communicate with the dead. Thus, viewing death not as an end of life, but instead shifting to a new phase with different surroundings, an evolution of sorts. The afterlife was no longer just some abstract idea, but something that you could actually tap into and communicate with someone who was there. As you may know, and we'll one day delve into, spiritualism was founded by the Fox sisters in 1848 when they took into soliciting knocks from spirits at their farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, grabbing the attention of locals and inspiring their older sister to start charging folks to come bear witness and observe the proceedings for a small fee. Within a few months, the three sisters were on a nationwide tour, and spiritualism was born. At the time, the world was reeling from the aftermath of war, leaving millions of American and European families grieving for lost sons and extremely vulnerable to the possibility of speaking to them in the afterlife, and so susceptible to fall into spiritualism. Though the followers of spiritualism have definitely dwindled since its heyday, it does still retain a large presence in England as well as the United States. So, In 1914, ectoplasm hit the scene, debuting in a series of truly bizarre photos in a best-selling book, The Phenomena of Materialization. And by 1922, it had reached the big time. It was a fixture among the table-tipping, communing with spirits zenith of spiritualism. But that wasn't all. Ectoplasm claimed to be the manifestation of spirit energy, which certain types of mediums called materializing mediums exuded in a trance state. Oh, my goodness. Get ready, everybody.
Okay.
Arthur Findlay, founder of the Arthur Findlay College for Mediumship and Other Spiritualist Pursuits, wrote about ectoplasm. This stuff seems to diffuse through the tissues of the medium like a gas and emerges through the orifices because it passes more freely through the mucous membrane than through the skin.
I want to know why then when we were conducting all these experiments with people actually dying and trying to get, the spirit, why there wasn't ectoplasm that we could have.
Well, just listen to all this nonsense that we're about to get into.
You got it.
He described it as a link between life and afterlife, a mixture of matter and ether, physical yet spiritual, a swirling, shining substance that unfortunately photographed like cheesecloth, kind of like me.
Shut up.
French surgeon and medical researcher Charles Richet discovered human thermoregulation and cutaneous transpiration, the insensible evaporation of water vapor through the skin, and was a pioneer in the treatment of tuberculosis. He was also awarded a Nobel Prize for his work on anaphylactic shock and was interested in studying the first materializing medium named Eva C. and was an advocate on speaking to the authenticity of ectoplasm. Surprisingly enough, he wasn't alone, as there were many spiritualist scientists, statesmen, and literary stars such as William James, William Butler Yeats, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, physicist Sir Oliver Lodge, and chemist Sir William Crookes, to name a few, were all part of this little movement. In 1989, Cambridge University acquired the archives of the Society for Psychical Research, which were the preeminent investigators of early mediums and their claims. This society would study for over 2 decades the subject of ectoplasm. God save us all. How does that even happen? I would be bored out of my mind.
20 years. Jesus. I was bored out of my mind for 2 hours researching the soul.
Scientific American sponsored an investigation of materializing mediums that was covered in 4 consecutive issues during 1924. In 1921, a popular Science Monthly made the observation that ectoplasm can assume the shape of a hand or a face or even a whole figure and is, quote, curiously like human skin and cellular structure. I don't know where they got this in the first place, because it doesn't seem to be the case. In 1922, Harvard grad student S.F. Damon was featured in the New York Times for his belief that ectoplasm was the first matter of the ancient alchemists. Between the years 1920 and 1925, the Times featured more than a dozen articles having to do with, quote, ectoplasm. But today, looking at the old photos of, quote, ectoplasm materializing from a soothsayer, it was clearly just gauze, and so it's difficult to understand why anyone would have been fooled by the situation, but it's just a case of probably wanting to be, I think.
No, Ashley, it photographs like gauze.
Oh.
It's real.
Oh, okay.
It just photographs that way.
Oh, interesting. A man by the name Fournier d'Albe recreated an ectoplasm photo, purchasing a yard of fine chiffon and publishing a shadowgraph close-up of it side by side with one of the ectoplasmic rods that they have gotten a shadowgraph of, and the two appeared identical. Shocking.
What?
In his 9th sitting with a medium, Kathleen Gallagher, whom he suspected of being a fraud, he asked the, quote, spirit in reference to the, quote, ectoplasm. In some places, it appears as if woven. Have you a loom in your world? Which I thought was pretty funny. He caught the lady levitating a stool with her foot, and after some time, he disproved her tomfoolery. She retired from mediumship in 1922, citing nerves.
Sure. I cite getting fucking caught.
Yeah, I think so. Another Boston medium named Marjorie Crandon was the queen of fooling the best and the brightest. In 1924, Scientific American offered $5,000 to any medium who could produce verifiable visual visual psychic manifestation, demonstrating their talents before a committee of investigators chaired by Scientific American staffer Malcolm Bird and including Harvard psychologist William McDougall, Massachusetts Institute of Technology,
MIT.
Why did I type the whole thing out? MIT Emeritus Dr. Daniel Comstock, Society of Psychical Research Officers Walter Prince and Harold Carrington, and tireless medium debunker Harry Houdini.
Yes, Harry Houdini. That's my boy.
That's your boy. That's my first time hearing this. I had no idea.
I thought I talked about Harry Houdini with you. He fucking hated spiritualists.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I don't.
My dad and I talk about it all the time.
I don't think we've talked about it. The only medium that these people found worthy to sit on the committee was Boston's Marjorie Crandon. After 20 seances, Scientific American was extremely divided in its conclusions. They truly were split, some believing that she was a total fraud, others being on the fence about it, and then the other two believing her ultimately that she was telling the truth. In the end, they came to the conclusion that she shouldn't be awarded the $5,000, and one would have to believe that the article Bird once wrote for them, containing a 7,000-word play-by-play of one of Marjorie's seances, that would be considered quite a low point for Scientific America, I would assume, because that does not sound like a good article in any way whatsoever. A team of Harvard zoologists and biologists would later study the substance that Marjorie claimed to be her ectoplasm, and it was determined to be sheep's omentum, or the curtain of fat that hangs down from the stomach and insulates the intestines of a sheep. While she was cool with the ectoplasm emerging from any orifice, it most likely appeared to emerge from a place that we all know and love, between the legs. That's where it used to emerge most of the time. About the vaginally excreted ectoplasm, Harvard professor William McDougall extolled, there is good evidence that ectoplasm issues, or did issue on some and probably all occasions, from one particular opening in the anatomy, i.e. the vagina.
Say the vagina, you fucking...
I know, why can't they just say it?
Oh my God, they sound like whoever wrote 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, I don't remember that lady's
They're like,
name.
her tingle, she had a tingling in her tummy when she's like describing an orgasm. Ma'am.
Okay. The more interesting question is, how did it come to be within the anatomy? There was nothing to show that its position there and its extrusion from that sacred place were achieved by other than normal means, is what he said. And McDougall may never have made a lady cream her pantaloons, I'm thinking, because he seems to be way unfamiliar with anything having to do with that, obviously. But what he really meant essentially was that she stuck it up there and then pulled it out. The sheep's omentum, by the way.
Oh, omentum.
The debate about Marjorie went on for over a year, with people wondering how in the world she could fit all these things that she was producing in her seances from her delicate flower. Some even positing that her husband, the obstetric surgeon who she was married to, was this very skilled obstetric surgeon, that he might have carried out some kind of surgical enlargement of her uterus, which is just outright absurd, I think. I really do.
What?
I think it's probably more likely that he sat beside her and handed her some stuff under the table. I don't think he enlarged her uterus. But she wasn't the first or the last, as there are records going back to 1726 of a woman named Mary Toft who claimed that she was giving birth to live baby rabbits for months until she finally was caught as a fraud, shockingly. Her downfall came when she tried to bribe a porter to procure her some rabbits and explained her tricks to him for some reason.
What an idiot. Why would you explain it?
Why would you do it to begin
It's
with?
the Magician's Creed. You don't explain your tricks. But also don't do it.
Don't put rabbits in your vagina. This was after a number of medical doctors had actually fallen for her fooling. So,
oh my God.
I know, but I mean, of course, it's 1726, but still.
Right, true.
So, as Mary Roach says, what is clear is that male medical professionals could be ruinously susceptible to vaginal deceits. And I think we all know that, ladies. Am I right? I believe so. Actually, this Mary Roach is kind of funny. I laughed a lot.
I laughed
honestly.
so much reading her book.
She's very sarcastic all the time.
Yes.
So Ectoplasm's last stand came with a woman named Helen Duncan. She had 8 kids hanging on and off of her at all times. Her seances were high drama. She often fainted, fell off of her chair, occasionally peed herself while lost in the frenzy of possession. And
oh my God.
once she emerged from her seance cabinet completely naked, covered by only a veil of ectoplasm. Quote unquote ectoplasm.
Oh my God.
However, by this point, mediums were being subjected to fucking thorough vaginal and rectal exams before seances. So Helen didn't have the luxury of exuding spirits from her vagina.
I'm horrified.
I know. She would then be enrobed in a special seance garment that went over her entire body with only her head sticking out. So it would be very difficult to get something out of the suit in the first place. Somehow, though, Ellen was able to produce a 6-foot-long ectoplasm, which they concluded at the time that she produced from a second stomach, like a rumen, somehow regurgitating the ectoplasm from that, which at that time was not somehow as crazy as it sounds because... Well, I'll get to that in a second, but if it were even remotely the case, it's more likely that she simply regurgitated it, and it wasn't coming from a second stomach in her. Like, let's get it together, everybody.
Okay, because I was horrified.
I don't understand. When she threw a tantrum after being asked to submit to a post-seance x-ray, she jumped up at the last minute and ran screaming into the street. They chased after her for 10 minutes, during which they presumed she regurgitated the cheesecloth that she'd swallowed, passed it off to her husband, who had first run after her, and then came back and was like, okay, I'm good to go. And then
okay, I'll do the x-ray. Oh my God.
After running out screaming.
Yeah.
And in another instance, she was asked to swallow a pill containing methylene blue so that anything that she regurgitated would be marked by the dye. And that night, she failed to produce anything at all. Shocking.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
When the group had compiled enough data to support their theory that Helen was a fraud, they spoke to her husband, who eventually concurred that it was likely his wife regurgitated cheesecloth and called it ectoplasm, but insisted it was subconscious regurgitation.
I'm sure, yeah.
Aptly, they pointed out that she would have to be subconsciously buying the cheesecloth, then swallowing the bag subconsciously, etc. They bribed him £100 to convince Helen to be filmed in the act, and he promised to do what he could, but the following morning, the pair ran off to Scotland. So.
Oh, well, that's not suspicious.
For the case of ectoplasm.
Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
Or not, yeah.
Gary Schwartz was a psychology professor at the University of Arizona and the founder of the university's Human Energy Systems Lab. He is best known for lab tests of mediums and wrote about it in his book, The Afterlife Experiments. His experimental data led him to the conclusion that there are mediums who can communicate with people who have died.
Okay.
Among his team included Alison Dubois, who the show Medium was based off of.
Oh.
Before she became a medium, she was on track to the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office as a criminal prosecutor. In April 2000, she says that she went downstairs to get laundry and a man walked through her. She says, I knew that he loved clam chowder and that he'd had a heart attack.
He loved clam chowder?
So she ran upstairs to tell her husband, Joe, who told her, that's my grandfather.
Okay, well, maybe.
So then she saw a Dateline segment about Gary Schwartz's research into mediums, and she decided that she was going to go see him, prove to herself that she wasn't really doing what she thought she was doing, and get back on track with her career. Because this happened over months, like she kept seeing these premonitions and stuff.
Okay.
But Schwartz was super impressed with her, and he told her that she'd had genuine talent, so her career was going to have to wait.
And, you know, I will say, like, as skeptical as this episode is, I have in my life encountered a handful of mediums that truly blew my socks off, where I don't know how they could have possibly been able to tell all the things that they did. So
sure.
I definitely have to say, as skeptical, because there's a lot of tricksters out there for sure too. But,
absolutely.
There are definitely people out there that have some sort of way to tap into something that we can't all do.
Right. So Schwartz had this study called the Asking Questions Study, and it addresses the question regarding why the dead that mediums communicate with give such vague answers and messages to questions that they are asked.
It's a good question.
Right?
Yeah.
Julie Bechel is the researcher behind the Asking Questions study. And she was a pharmacology student whose interest in the paranormal was planted after losing her mother, which is common. And the reason that spiritualism wasn't at an all-time high during the era of the Fox sisters, like we just talked about. So she assembled a list of 32 questions about the afterlife. Some of the questions and answers included question, what do you do every day? And then the answer was, she's showing herself eating at the table. How is the weather? It's Florida without the humidity. Are there angels? Yeah, but they've got their own clique going. They've got their own little deal going on.
Oh, these are they're a little vague.
Yeah.
But, maybe it's difficult to communicate. I don't know.
Maybe they can only communicate through feelings or colors like in Hellier.
Yeah. Who
Right?
knows? Mm-hmm.
According to Matla and Zalberg Van Zelst, they would ask questions to spirits as well in a non-formal setting. The spirits, like I mentioned earlier, also happen to be very scientifically minded. Super coincidental.
Oh, just like them.
Yeah.
Oh.
And tended to provide answers that were detailed, but not necessarily things that were interesting.
That sounds like me.
They'd talk about the density and specific gravity of a spirit, or the fact that when they need to move faster, they become a spiral. And although they are nearsighted, they can see through our clothing and sometimes through our skin. And if the room is quiet, they can even read our thoughts.
Get out of here.
The final tragedy that these two scientists discovered is that in the afterlife, there is no sex.
Oh, come on.
This is bullshit.
It is. I'm out of here.
I'm out. I'm out of death.
No death for me, please.
No, thank you. Arthur Finlay, one of the founders of the International Institute for Psychical Research and one of the founders of the newspaper Psychic News, was a huge figure in spiritualism. Arthur, over the course of 3 seances with a medium named Sloan, asked 53 questions about the afterlife. And when he asked, will you tell me something about your world? The medium gave the reply, quote, we can sit down together and enjoy each other's company. We have books and we can read them. We can have a long walk in the country. We all smell the same aroma of the flowers and the fields that you do. We gather the flowers as you do. Here we have no decay in flower or field as you have. Vegetable life just stops growing and disappears.
Huh. Okay.
Reverend Doctor. Reverend Dr. G. Owen, in a 1923 New York Times article, said that businessmen are needed in heaven, doctors are not needed to treat spirit patients because diseases don't exist, and they are immediately engaged in different specialties and lines of research.
Okay. All right.
In the spirit world.
Okay. Like, do I want a job in the spirit world? I'm not sure.
I feel like after I die, I don't want to work again. I just feel like I don't want to do that.
I don't know.
Do I need a job
I don't know.
Spirits walk, but some ride chariots, although they don't need them, but they think they're convenient, which makes no sense.
No.
It's convenient. I don't need it, but it's convenient.
I'll just float there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Unless I'm just like riding a horse bareback or something, because I couldn't bear to do that. I'll say bear one more time. I couldn't bring myself to do that in real life. Then I don't need a ride if I'm floating around. Just let me float, please. Let me zoom here and there.
Turn into a spiral.
I'll spiral my way out of here. I don't know what I'm saying.
Back to Schwartz.
Okay.
After he published a paper detailing the afterlife experiments, Ray Hyman, a University of Oregon professor, published a piece in the Skeptical Inquirer called How Not to Test Mediums, featuring a slew of criticisms of Schwartz methodology, including...
It was like a straight up bitch.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I read the article. It's like an article.
Okay.
It's like a lot.
And it's basically saying, this is how you don't do it, Schwartz.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So the criticisms of his methodology included inappropriate controlled comparisons, inadequate precautions against fraud and sensory leakage, reliance on non-standardized, untested dependent variables, failure to use double-blind procedures, inadequate blinding even in what he calls single-blind experiments, failure to independently check on facts the sitters endorsed as true, and the use of plausibility arguments to substitute for actual controls.
I agree with all these.
Other problems included the failure to use adequate randomization procedures, using only sitters who are predisposed to the survival hypothesis. The absolute worst piece of evidence was the fact that Schwartz's sitters had been allowed to rate the readings, and they, of course, knew which reading had been their own.
Oh.
Like grading your own essay, which, of course, you're going to think is phenomenal.
Yeah.
This has actually gone on for quite a while, and in fact, 1930s project was detailed in Overview of Quantitatively Evaluated Studies with Mediums and Psychics in 1994.
Wow.
This detail found that the subject's judgments of the accuracy of medium statements pertaining to their loved ones were strongly influenced by their knowing whether or not the statements were intended for them. Mm-hmm. Of course. It's pretty clear with vague statements being made like, I'm getting an R name, or they were born in the spring or summer.
Did someone
doing vague shit like that.
Did someone here lose a brother or a cousin or a dad? Maybe a grandpa?
I'm getting a male figure. And people so badly want to have that closure that if their dad's name is Robert or they have an Uncle Raymond, people are going to 100% believe that those types of messages are intended for them.
Yeah. Understandable, but, at the same time, it's like probably not going to be the case that when you go to a group setting and you're immediately like emotional or you're clinging on to an item or you're giving and like who knows how those are the things you have to think about. How did you get there?
Absolutely.
How did you sign up for that place? Did this person have an ability to look you up before you came? There's like so many factors in this.
Yes, exactly. So Michael Persinger, who is a neuroscience professor at the Consciousness Research Lab at Laurentian University, theorizes that certain patterns of electromagnetic field activity, including the Earth's natural and man-made energy, wiring, appliances, power lines, can make the brain more prone to hallucinations.
Yeah.
In 1988, he published a study comparing 37 years of Fate magazine hauntings with geomagnetic activity. And he did find a correlation and wrote his findings in an article called Neuroscience Letters. 3 years later, in a similar study, University of Iowa psychologists Walter and Stephanie Randall examined monthly fluctuations in solar winds, which influence the Earth's geomagnetics, to see if they followed monthly ups and downs in humanoid hallucinations, and both studies showed peaks in April and September with a dip in between those months. In 1996, Persinger focused on man-made electromagnetic fields. I'm going to call them EMFs from here on out.
Okay.
And during this year, a Sudbury, Ontario couple contacted him about strange things happening in their house. They heard breathing and whispering sounds, even at one point feeling someone or something touching their feet while they were in bed.
Ew.
The husband said he saw an apparition of a woman who looked like she was moving through their bed. So, Persinger and two of his colleagues went out to the house and set up equipment to monitor the EMFs in some of the rooms of the house. And it turns out there were wires in the house that were poorly grounded, and circuits were overloaded with electronic equipment, and the EMFs were most intense in the places where the couple had experienced paranormal activity.
Oh.
But there were some signs of the home having what's described as haunt-prompting fields, meaning that they could have been generating a synthetic ghost.
Oh.
So Mary, the author of this book, tried to recreate a laboratory-generated EMF in Persinger's lab. This was done in what he calls Haunt Box, a soundproof freight elevator-sized chamber with a couch in the middle and a yellow and brown shag carpeting. Persinger would direct EMFs into subjects' brains while they were wearing a special helmet. His theory regarding hauntings is that exposure to EMFs lowers melatonin levels, being that melatonin is an anticonvulsive So if you have less of it in your system, particularly your right temporal lobe, you could be more prone to tiny epileptic-esque microseizures and the subtle hallucinations that these seizures can cause. Additionally, the emotions of mourning a loved one produces stress hormones that may raise the likelihood of the microseizures further. There was another report written regarding the link between spirituality and tiny seizures in the temporal lobe in 2002. A study of 242 undergrad volunteers was done, and scores on a 98-item spirituality assessment were predictive of scores on a questionnaire that also assessed a cluster of symptoms of complex partial epilepsy, including hallucinations, fear, and a sense of detachment from one's body. This is known as temporal lobe epilepsy, and it is a condition which often goes undiagnosed. So, because there is no medical explanation of these events, patients interpret them as spiritual events.
Wow.
Of the 1,000 people who have had Persinger's EMF bursts applied to their right temporal lobes, 80% say that they have felt a presence. Mary Roach, during her experiment, said that in her experience, she really wanted to feel something, but she pretty much felt absence in the beginning. Toward the end, however, she began to see and hear things. She began to see glimpses of faces. She was hearing whispers. And at one point, she heard a police siren in the distance. At the end of the experiment, she asked Dr. Persinger about the siren, and he informed her that there was no siren, and also, like I said before, it was a soundproofed room. Persinger let her know that based on the questionnaire she took prior to the experiment, she was left hemispherically dominant. She left the experiment with the conclusion that perhaps she had never experienced a ghost because her temporal lobes are just not wired for it. And that really could be the main difference between skeptics and believers. It's just the neural structure that they were born with.
I want to change it then, because, like, why?
Yeah, but you want... Well, I guess that's true.
Yeah, because I haven't seen anything. So, thousands upon thousands of Americans and Europeans believe that tape recorders can capture the voices of something beyond the veil. These are referred to as electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, and that's the last time I'm going to explain that, because there's nothing that drives me more crazy than when I'm watching a show and they're
God.
This is EVP, an electronic voice phenomena. By the way, it's like, okay, we get it. Everyone knows by now. But then I thought, there may be somebody listening that does not know. So that is it. I'm not saying it anymore. True. Typically, the researchers do not hear them in the moment. Only upon playing the recording back do they realize that they have a voice coming through the recorder. As we've slightly touched on, some are very distinct and clear words and whispers and are incredibly compelling and hard to explain, barring any trickery. But many are impossible to make anything of, and they just sound like a bunch of metallic noise, and then you have someone telling you, I hear a man saying, George, help, and then people are like, I hear it too, and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. So EVPs first came on the scene in 1959 when a Swedish opera singer and painter, Fredrik Jurgensen, set up a mic on the windowsill of his home in Stockholm, intending to record bird calls. Upon listening back, Jurgensen heard as a titmouse was suddenly drowned out by a male voice saying something about bird songs at night, and soon after he heard a man humming Volare. Initially, he thought he picked up some errant radio broadcast or transmission, but he eventually concluded it was unlikely because over the next few weeks, he picked up voices that seemed to speak to him by name, and even more bizarre, his poodle, Carino. Jurgensen wrote a book about his experiences, which caught the eye of a psychologist named Konstantin Rodiv. He began hunting down EVPs of his own, eventually accumulating over 70,000 recordings and a book deal.
Jeez.
His book, Breakthrough, An Amazing Experiment in Electronic Communication with the Dead, in 1971, gave birth to an entire movement and many, many do-it-yourself EVP societies, many that exist to this day. Instead of taping air, Rodiv developed his own techniques, which might sound a little familiar. He taped radio static. Again, he recorded something that spoke to him by name on numerous occasions, he says. It was around this time that a Cambridge University student named David Ellis underwent admission to investigate EVP for a 2-year Perot-Warwick fellowship. One of his first steps was to get Dr. Rodiv into a room screened off so that it blocked radio transmissions. Even though he never really believed that they were the source of EVP to begin with, it was a factor that they needed to control. Unfortunately, they didn't record anything terribly conclusive in that room, whether that's because the room wasn't in a great spot for any action or some other reason, it wasn't very clear. Psychologists use the quote, verbal transformation effect as an explanation for EVPs. B.F. Skinner once played a nonsense sequence of vowels to subjects and asked them to tell him when they heard something with meaning. Not only did they hear actual words, they were entirely convinced that their interpretations were correct. The mind is a powerful thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's always on the right track. In one experiment, a group of people were handed a pencil and paper and asked to help transcribe a poor quality recording of a lecture. They had compiled together over a dozen phrases, some whole sentences, and the tape was nothing but white noise. A psychology professor at the University of Western Ontario, Imants Barus, believes that science has gathered enough evidence to prove that there is life after death. He believes Gary Schwartz and Ian Stevenson's research, 2 men that we've talked about earlier, to be part of that proof, but he doesn't believe EVP are part of it. That said, he performed 81 45-minute recordings of radio static, and he picked up various things from a low whistle, a squawking noise accompanied by someone saying, with imagination, a hello. He got tell Peter and hello in another recording, and along with what someone working with him interpreted as her own name, which was Gail. That said, he believed none of the phenomena found were clearly anomalous, let alone attributable to discarnate beings. And I can give him that, but then what about those voices that he did catch? And I will absolutely agree that there are a lot of EVP out there that are dubious at best, but there are, to repeat myself for the millionth time, a lot of truly compelling EVP that I don't know how you can explain away by tricks of the brain or ambiguous sounds forming words. Like, where it's clearly saying something. Yeah. There is something called I don't know what's happening. There is something called the ducting effect, in which now and again oddities in the electronic layers of the ionosphere create small ducts that allow fragments of radio broadcasts or walkie-talkie communication to travel thousands of miles, which possibly could explain some of the random words people catch in EVP. Yeah. And reading that did make me feel like, oh, well, shit. It's possible, I guess.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff I've heard could even have been that. Wilson von Dusen was the chief psychologist at the Mendocino State Hospital in Northern California for many years at an inpatient facility for the severely mentally ill, and spent a lot of time with patients who spoke about the voices in their heads, the, quote, others. The voices were very distinctly good and evil, with the latter harassing and threatening them, and the much more rare former encouraging and inspiring them. He decided he needed to try to talk to these voices themselves, asking indirect questions, asking the patient to write word for word what their responses were. He held long discussions with the patient's others this way, and began to picture them as physical manifestations of scowling old men in ratty slippers, grumbling in the halls, and ruining people's good times. He began to think that these others weren't hallucinations after all, but were actual beings of some other world, of some other order in the world. Van Dusen...
That's terrible.
I know, but I mean, I was also like, whoa, what if it is, though? We don't know. We have no idea. I know scientifically it's slightly iffy, but how do we explain it? We don't know how to explain that.
Like
really.
Schizophrenia?
Yeah. So Van Dusen is a Swedenborgian, a follower of the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century engineer, inventor, anatomist who at 40 began getting religious visions. He dreamt of a heaven where wingless angels and demons lived who had once been mortal humans. He felt like these were incredibly similar to his patient's other personalities, which... if you're a subscriber to that belief system, then it's very, again, very easy to be like, that's what this is. But
Right.
that according to Hearing Voices Network, if a brain scan is done on someone with schizophrenia while they are hearing voices, the scan shows activity in the part of the brain involved in speech production, which indicates that the voices are the, quote, inner speech of the person who hears them. So where do they originate is the question. From some other consciousness or what? What is it? I don't know. And neither do you. Not you.
I'm just thinking like maybe it's a chemical. I mean, maybe it really is just like a chemical imbalance. Like,
yeah, I mean, it's possible.
Schizophrenia is such a scary thing to me that like the paranoia and the everything about schizophrenia is like so scary to me because it's not known to me. You know, I don't know. I'm not schizophrenic, so I wouldn't know what that's like. But I know that there is medication available to stabilize that type of, you know, chemical imbalance.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I don't.
But is that just, you know, muting some sort of brainwave that you have opened up to something that allows you to hear something from a different plane of existence? Or is that just a chemical imbalance that in your own brain is making up other personalities in your head?
I don't know. I think I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, who knows? Who really knows? The majority of EVP groups are fairly positive that the phenomenon is communication with the dead, no question. They are convinced by what they hear, and on the whole, they do not feel compelled to be too overly critical about the origin of the results. And I feel like there's probably some gray area between the unconditional, no skepticism whatsoever, and then the so much skepticism that you can't even begin to explore the possibilities of what you couldn't explain in your research, because that doesn't help anything. If you're like, it wasn't that, that's it. You know, it's like, well, what is it then? I need you to be able to find the gray area and try to explore some options here. Pretty much everything in the whole world lies in the gray areas of life, and I don't know why the afterlife would be an exception.
Sure.
Edison, Tesla, and Bell all believed the soul and I don't think I need to explain who those men are. All believed the soul survived after death and traveled like a wireless impulse to an etheric realm somewhere, but they did not believe in the mediums or their claims. They did, however, believe themselves to be worthy of the time interdimensional beings might take to communicate with them, much more so than any old plebeian, that's for sure. They were like,
definitely Tesla, definitely Bell.
He was like,
not Edison.
If anybody, what do you mean?
Edison was a piece of
Oh,
shit.
you mean worthy? But they all felt themselves to be extremely worthy. They're like, if anyone was going to if any old spirit were going to talk to any human being, it would definitely be us because we're so smart, which they were. So, well, you know. So Bell and his brother made a pact that whichever brother died first, the dead brother would attempt to make contact with the surviving brother through more reliable means than any old medium that comes into town. And Edison even attempted to build a device that would enable personalities which have left this earth to communicate with us, but he sadly became one of those personalities he was trying to communicate with before he ever finished it.
Because he never actually invented anything because he's a piece of shit.
I guess we have to go into that sometime. So engineer and psychoacoustics researcher Vic Tandy had an experience well over 20 years ago that drove him to try and find more answers. He worked at a life support systems manufacturing plant, and one night as he returned to his lab, the cleaner lady ran by him with a terrified look on her face, telling him there was a ghost in there. She said she'd been feeling uneasy, and then a gray thing appeared in the corner of her eye, and she ran. He initially thought that there was an anesthetic bottle leaking, causing the cleaner to hallucinate, but there was nothing amiss, so he chalked it up to simply nervousness. But the next night, as he was working alone, he began to feel a little strange himself. He said, "I felt my hackles go up." Again, he suspected fumes, but when that didn't check out, he thought maybe he was He thought maybe it was late and he just needed a cup of coffee. He went back into the lab after his coffee and again began to feel uneasy. He said, "Then I see this gray object around to the side of me. I would say I was projecting a form onto it, trying to make sense of it, but it had arms and legs at one point. I turned to look at it and it disappeared." Then the next night, he brought his fencing foil in, he was a fencer, to fix, and he left it in a vise as he worked at his desk. When suddenly he turned around and the whole thing was moving on its own. It scared the shit out of him. But, like most pragmatic people do, he thought, no, I need to figure this out. There's a reason for this. I'll find out. He slid his fencing foil around on the floor and watched the places where it tended to vibrate, and he came to the conclusion that a possible reason for these visions and unexplainable movements was none other than a topic that we've discussed before, infrasound, which you also spoke about a little bit earlier. We know that right? Am I hallucinating? Yes. We know that infrasound are low-frequency sound waves which are inaudible to the naked human ear. And he did happen to find a sharp peak at 19 hertz in the lab when he set up his measuring equipment, which does fall in the infrasound range of 0 to 20 hertz. Like we talked about briefly in MK Ultra and the Dyatlov Pass episodes, infrasound can cause a number of mysterious-seeming side effects like tingling, hair raising, emotions to swell, and most definitely that includes fear. There was an unwitting audience at Liverpool's Metropolitan Cathedral in 2002 that were subjected to infrasound impulses during certain points during a piano concert. The audience members later described this as tingling on the back of their neck or a strange feeling in their stomach, along with an intensification of emotions. Infrasound can also cause some vision irregularities, at times blurring, others vibrating the visual field. The eyeball has a resonant frequency of 19 hertz, which means that in the presence of a 19 hertz infrasound wave, the eye would start to vibrate along with the infrasound wave.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So as an adaptation for dealing with predators sneaking up on us from the side, our eyeballs have made it so that our peripheral vision is extremely sensitive to movement. And I can't tell you how many ghost stories I've heard of someone, and I'm not discrediting that either, but it also, there is a possibility that your eye's vibrating or something, you know?
Right. Well, your eye is full of, like, goo. It's full of liquid.
It's a goo-filled ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that everything inside would be vibrating.
And if it was, what does that do to your vision, and what does that do to create things in your vision, you know?
Right.
Eventually he identified, or going back to Tandy, eventually he identified the source of the infrasonic peak, which was a large do-it-yourself exhaust fan in the basement of the building. All this business got him wondering if all the famous quote-unquote haunted spots in England were actually side effects of infrasound. Many of the old buildings have thicker, more solid walls, which resonate better, and many times are empty, which means that there are less things to absorb sound waves. It would also explain why reports of haunts tend to be somewhat localized. Infrasound can also evoke the fight or flight response, and a side effect of that is the curtailing of blood to the extremities, which would explain the chills that people get, and also the racing heart, la-di-da, it equals unease. And again, while this could explain 100% some, even many paranormal experiences or hotspots, I believe that it 100% cannot explain every single one of them. Just so some are just beyond the realm of scientific explanation currently, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. They're beyond our current realm of scientific explanation. That's not to say that everything is paranormal, but it's not to say that nothing is paranormal.
Yeah, maybe we just don't know how to explain it. But all that said, studies show that only a small percentage of the population is sensitive to infrasound. NASA astronauts are exposed to massive infrasound vibrations on liftoff to no ill effects. And in experiments with large groups of people at a cellar that he had found infrasonic waves outside of, only a small amount of the people were affected or felt anything at all when exposed to the same cellar in that same evening. So again, are some haunted locales actually just some kind of weird electrical anomaly? Probably so. Are all of them? Oh, hell no. I don't believe.
So in 1925 in Mocksville, North Carolina, James Pickney Chaffin Jr. was living with his wife and daughter, and on one morning in the summer, he told his wife that his father, who had been dead for 4 years, appeared to him by his bedside. James Pinckney Chaffin Jr. was a man who was pretty stoic. He wasn't one to believe in prophetic dreams, ghost stories, or really even practical jokes. He told his wife several times during that month that he had dreamed of his father appearing at his bedside with a sorrowful expression, and that the night previously his father had appeared in a black overcoat, which he recognized from when he had been alive. According to James, his father stepped closer to the bed, opened up one side of his overcoat, and pointed to the inside pocket, saying, "You will find something about my last will in my overcoat pocket." According to the Davie County Clerk's Office, in 1905, his last will and testament directed his entire estate, 102 acres of farmland, to his second youngest son, Marshall, leaving nothing at all to James, his older brother, John, or the youngest son, Abner. Being that typically land was left to the eldest, the three brothers were bitter about it, but they didn't contest it. Because of this premonition, James looked for his father's overcoat, and he found it in John's attic. According to his testimony, he'd found the lining had been sewn together and immediately cut the stitches and found a little roll of paper tied with a string in his father's handwriting and contained the words, "Read the 27th chapter of Genesis in my daddy's old Bible."
What is this, like, fucking goose hunt he's gone on here?
He's got a scavenger hunt for his will.
Uh-huh.
Genesis 27 is the parable of Isaac, when he was old and blind, accidentally giving his blessing to his youngest son Jacob as opposed to his eldest Esau. Jacob tricked Isaac into giving him his blessing by covering his hands and neck with goat skins because Esau was hairy and Jacob wasn't. And because Isaac was blind, he wanted to make sure he was bestowing his blessing onto the right son.
Okay.
And when I think of a hairy man, I think of goat skin immediately. Also, wouldn't they have different voices? I don't know.
Yeah, you think if you were blind that you would have a better sense of hearing, a more developed sense of hearing, or you would be able to figure out, not just
the
by
whole
touching.
thing just doesn't make sense. But okay, whatever.
No, it's just a fucking story.
Anyways, so James made his way to his mom's house and found the Bible in the attic. In Genesis 27, there was a piece of paper folded up that held a second will dated 1919, dividing the land equally among the 4 children.
Why didn't you put that one in officially then?
So Marshall, the son who the land was given to, actually died literally less than a year after inheriting all of the land, but his widow Susie immediately contested the second will, so they went to trial. Of course, it was a crazy story and word spread, and by the time the trial arrived, press were swarming the court. James arrived with 10 witnesses of family, friends, and neighbors, and they were all prepared to say that the signature on the second will was in fact James Chaffin Sr.'s, although the will itself did not have any witness signatures.
Oh, troubling all around, I'd say.
The jury was sworn in, and then the judge called for a lunch break. During the recess, Susie and the brothers reached a deal. Susie withdrew her opposition and stated that the signature was in fact genuine, and she and the brothers decided to share the estate equally. The court formally decreed that the document, a paper whose location had been pointed out by an apparition, was the last will and testament of James L. Chaffin Sr. Of course, with all of the lead up to the trial being so exciting, reporters were initially disappointed with such a quick solution occurring. However, they left with an even better story, running headlines like "Dead Man Returns in Dream" and "Can the Dead Speak from the Grave?" About a year later, Britain's Society for Psychical Research, SPR, heard about the case and hired a local lawyer to interview the family and submit a report. J. McN. Johnson of Aberdeen, North Carolina, was a lawyer and said he didn't really have respect for the beliefs of the SPR, but promised to have an open mind. He got sworn statements by James and the man who had driven James to find the coat and Bible, Thomas Blackwelder. Johnson was impressed by the sincerity of the claim and wrote the SPR in 1927, I believe I'm safe in asserting that if you once talked with these very honest people and looked into their clear, unsophisticated countenances, your criticism would vanish into thin air, as did mine, and concluded that the will was genuine and the ghost story was improbable but true.
But just because they're too simple to lie?
I guess. He also ruled out the possibility that the second will was fake, as not only the witnesses, but Susie, the defendant herself, agreed that the handwriting of the second will was that of James Sr. The SPR, however, needed more convincing. In response, Johnson received a 10-page letter from the SPR honorary officer, W.H. Salter. Salter felt that the case had irregularities, which of course it did. Like if he changed his mind and now wanted his land divided among all of his 4 sons, why hide the will so carefully and tell not literally anybody about it at all? Johnson replied to the letters saying that he had been told by a neighbor that James Sr. lived in, quote, mortal terror of Susie.
Oh.
Who had that 1905 will, and changing his will would have meant confronting her, which he did not want to do. So perhaps he hid the new will and planned to tell his sons about it on his deathbed, but misjudged the timing of death and died before he could actually tell them.
It's a bad plan.
It's not a good one. Salter didn't buy it, however, and came up with his own scenario, which actually was more convoluted. His theory was that it was the eldest son, John, with the help of the youngest brother, Abner, faked the will and the slip of paper in the overcoat pocket, and James Jr. was made the unwitting pawn in the plot because he was moved to discover the will, which would be accomplished by making Jr. believe he'd seen his father's ghost when it was actually his brother John dressed up in the overcoat.
That's mean.
Jesus. So, in 2004, Mary Roach took a trip to Mocksville and talked to the descendants of the Chaffin brothers, found the 2 wills, and hired a forensic examiner to take a look at them. So, these forensic examiners can read imprints of one's writing on a pad as much as 10 pages down from the page that it was initially written on.
Oh.
They found that the first will was written by someone else, probably a lawyer, because it was written on legal-size paper along with a lot of legal terminology. And the second will was a mixture of legal terminology and regular writing written on a page from a rolled school tablet. It was determined expediently that whoever wrote the second will wasn't trying to copy someone else's handwriting, as it was too fluid and relaxed, while forged writing is more of a slow, deliberate start and stop, even sometimes touching up the letters. The signatures also, of course, had to be compared. The first will is likely to be James Sr.'s, and the second one is also his, but it's a little convoluted by the fact that there are 14 years between the 2 documents, and not only does handwriting change, but so do signatures over time. I know mine definitely has. The conclusion he reached is that because handwriting typically deteriorates with old age due to bad vision, stiffening fingers, tremors.
Sounds fun.
And the situation is reverse, and the second will is actually suspicious.
No.
In 1905, when he was in his 50s, the signature was much worse than the 1919 signature.
Huh.
The latter will also contains phrasing that is suspicious for the education level of James Sr., stating that he wanted his property to be divided between his 4 children, quote, if they are living at my death, and if not living, give their share to their children. Therefore, with that statement in the will, technically, Susie is out of the picture. So, it could be that on the trial's lunch, the brothers approached Susie and told her that they had 10 witnesses prepared to testify it was James' writing. So rather than losing everything, why not just make the whole ordeal easier and take 1/4 of the land?
They bamboozled her.
Yeah, I think they 100% bamboozled her.
And I mean, they deserve some of that stuff. So, I mean, I don't know, but they shouldn't have bamboozled me. And they definitely shouldn't have made their brother think he saw his dead dad and get all excited about it. But,
yeah.
You know, we're going to start talking about we're coming towards the end of this, and we're going to start talking about some near-death experiences. When a person has to have a defibrillator insertion surgery, an electrical charge hits the heart at the crest of a specific EKG peak, which derails the beat and renders the organ incapable of pumping blood. Without the delivery of oxygen to the brain, the person is dead within seconds. And for those of us that watched Flatliners as children, you know that as long as the heart begins beating within about 4 minutes, there's no permanent brain damage that occurs. Thinking about this made me wonder what the final deal sealer is for your energy leaving your body. It's got a 4-minute window? What the hell? The University of Virginia is one of only 3 American universities that has a parapsychology research unit or laboratory. In 1968, Xerox machine inventor Chester Carlson, after being urged by his wife, donated a significant amount of millions to the university for research to answer the question of survival of consciousness after death. It has since been a hotly divided topic among those at the university, some thinking it a complete waste of time and resources, while the other half thinks it is a valuable contribution to medical science. And it is here in an operating room used to perform this exact type of procedure that they have a laptop attached to the ceiling above the operating table. This computer belongs to Professor Bruce Grayson of the university's Department of Psychiatric Medicine. Grayson has been studying near-death experiences, NDEs for those in the know, and what I'm going to continue to call them from here on out, for over 29 years. In all of these NDEs, the person has come close to dying and recalls having been someplace other than simply being blacked out inside their body. Some recall simply hovering at the ceiling above their body. One of my best friends had this exact experience in an ambulance after being in a terrible car accident when we were kids.
Oh, God.
And she remembered a lot of things that were happening in the ambulance with her that I don't know how she could have known when she was in there by herself. But who knows? Some remember being hurtled through a tunnel of sorts, often towards an all-encompassing light, sometimes toward loved ones who have died. Those who remember hovering often say that they watched their operation or resuscitation from above, and these descriptions are often very detailed and accurate, but some argue that the patients were creating a story from things that they heard or felt, or even memories of previous hospital visits or TV. So, Grayson is trying to find out if these folks are up on the ceiling when they're dead for those few minutes that they were technically dead, or were they not up on the ceiling? He began his study in early 2004, and he aimed to interview 80 defibrillator insertion patients just after they came out of anesthesia. If they mentioned any kind of out-of-body experience, he asked them to describe everything they saw from above. Grayson's laptop is open flat to the ceiling with an image. There's 1 of 12 images in 1 of 5 colors that's randomly selected by a computer program, so it's facing the ceiling, so you can't see it unless you're in the ceiling.
On the ceiling, yeah.
While ingenious, at the time that Roach interviewed him, none of the patients had expressed that they had an out-of-body experience. It stands to reason, as this is a very small sample size to be drawing from, and it's
0.
It's unlikely to you're going to just always catch somebody that is like, I had an out-of-body experience. Grayson said that the cocktail of anesthesia used for surgery would work against retaining any sort of memories, though he also mused, if the consciousness is leaving the brain, then would memory even matter? Which is a really valid question. Curiously, cardiologists and not parapsychologists have published the most widely read studies on NDEs, a notable one being published in The Lancet in 2001 by Dutch cardiologist Pim van Lommel, whose objective was simple, to find out what causes near-death experiences. Anesthesia and oxygen deprivation are common theories, and they're valid because they both cause elements of NDEs, as well as intense stress or heightened emotional states, endorphins, and even seizures like Bianca talked about. Then there's, talked about for hallucinations, but this is talking about for near-death experiences, which I guess are implying could be a hallucination. Then there's the more compelling possibility that our consciousness exists and operates independently of our bodies somehow. Van Lommel interviewed 344 cardiac arrest patients in 10 separate Dutch hospitals. All of the patients have been clinically dead, and all interviews were done within a few days of their resuscitation. 18% reported at least one element of an NDE. In the cardiac arrest NDE, the patient's memory, perception, and consciousness are functioning at a time when they have lost all function of the cortex and brainstem. It's like a computer with its power source unplugged and its circuits detached, somehow doing stuff. The low percentage of resuscitated patients that have any type of NDE led Lommel to rule out medical explanations like lack of oxygen to the brain. He said, with a purely physiological explanation such as cerebral anoxia, most patients who have been clinically dead should report having a near-death experience, but they don't. He also found that, statistically speaking, the medication the subject was under was unrelated to the likelihood that they have an NDE. And as for anesthesia, he made the point that people under anesthesia that aren't close to death have far fewer NDEs than people who are close to death without being under anesthesia. So it's hard to see how drugs could be the cause of them. Additionally, fear, religious belief, gender, and education level didn't seem to be related to near-death experiences. One of the last explanations left, to quote Van Lommel's paper in The Lancet, as he says, near-death experience was a state of consciousness in which identity, cognition, and emotion function independently from the body, but retain the possibility of non-sensory perception. He ended his paper encouraging readers to explore, or at the very least be open to the possibility that people who experienced NDEs are having a transcendent experience. Their consciousness exists in an invisible, immaterial world.
So I was just going to say, I had watched, I don't know if this is a good place to say it, but I had watched a video a couple years back of this, was it a man or a woman? I think it was a man who had a near-death experience. And he was in a car accident with his wife. I believe it was either that or the other way around, but I think it was a man with his wife. And he described this type of transcendent experience and described a whole sense of calm that he had because he lost his wife. And I believe there was a child in the backseat, and she passed the child passed as well. But that he had a transcendent experience in which the wife had said that everything was going to be fine and that that he just needed to move on, and that it was just her time for her soul to be reborn into another body, and so on and so forth, to experience her next level of education. So like the near-death experience that's why I believe in the reincarnation theory. Yeah. Because I don't know that I believe that energy ever ends. And I do think that I might be open to the fact or the possibility that we are reborn into different bodies and experience different things. For instance, I have like gone to past life therapists that have said that in a past life I was a priest's daughter or somebody's daughter or something like that, or a son or a man or a woman, or I think it would be entirely possible that somebody like you and I have had a relationship in a past life before, whether it's you were a mother to me or I was a mother to you, or you were my husband or something like that. So sorry to like interrupt you with that whole story, but fine. Just like hearing about this kind of reminded me about that particular video that I watched. I'll send it to you. You might be interested in it. It's a long video. It's like an hour long.
Oh my. I watched, I was watching something. I don't remember what it was, like Unexplained. I don't remember, but there was a brain surgeon that ended up having meningitis where he went to a coma, and he was like, nobody survives this type of meningitis that he had. And he clearly remembered going to this place that he described in great detail, and he actually survived somehow. And he like says, I had all of these memories, and how could I, yes. His brain was flatlined, dead, and how could I have had these memories if my brain wasn't active at all? And so he now is the huge proponent for that we do have a consciousness that lives outside of our bodies, or that can survive outside of our bodies in some way. And that was extremely compelling. That was a very truncated description, but it was I was like, it was just happened to be whenever I was reading this book. But anyway, Very interesting stuff. The first, the first cardiologist to study NDEs was a doctor named Michael Sabom. After being, how many times are we going to say somebody's name on this episode? After being unsatisfied with the anecdotal approach that he saw some taking on the NDE topic, he set out to do a controlled study of his own. Of 116 cardiac arrest survivors he interviewed, only 6 could recall specific medical details
Wow.
they'd seen during their NDE or out-of-body experience. Shh, I had to do it.
At least once.
Each of their descriptions of what they observed during their resuscitations were compared to the report of the incident in their medical file. In exactly 0 of those medical reports did the statements contradict what had actually transpired,
Whoa.
nor were there any medical errors whatsoever.
Whoa.
He then asked 25 people who had spent time in coronary care units under similar circumstances to those of his subject group. All of them were familiar with all the various equipment and were asked to describe what they would expect to see if their heart stopped beating and they had to be resuscitated. 22 of the 25 contained incredibly obvious medical gaffes, things that would just never happen in an actual emergency room. Here's so basically what that says is these people who had no experience whatsoever were giving in exact detail what exactly happened to them. And then people who actually had experience with this type of equipment and this type of situation, but did not have a near-death experience, could not tell you what the fuck happened if they were going to need to be resuscitated. So he thought that was interesting. So here's a passage from one interview with one of his patients who had a near-death experience. He asked them, "Where did they put those paddles on your chest?" And the person answered, "Well, they weren't paddles, doctor. They were round discs with a handle on them. They put one up here. I think it was larger than the other one, and they put one down here." He asked, "Did they do anything to your chest before they put those things on it?" And the person answered, "They put a needle in me. They took it two-handed. I thought it was very unusual, and they shoved it into my chest like that. He took the heel of his hand and his thumb and shot it home." And that was exactly what happened. There were more with incredibly accurate and also fairly mundane, because it's incredibly accurate detail. Some try to explain it by saying that trying to explain that these people experienced or knew this stuff because they heard it happen, because hearing is the last sense to disappear when people lose consciousness. And perhaps they overheard the medical staff and in their mind painted the picture for them, or they even partially opened their eyes and actually saw some of these things that they reported. But it doesn't necessarily explain the great detail.
Right.
When, in the early 2000s, epilepsy researchers at the Program of Functional Neurology and Neurosurgery at the University Hospitals of Geneva and Lausanne discovered a site within the brain that, when stimulated, caused the perception of looking down on one's body from above. The patients truly believed that they were looking down on themselves. But the catch here is that it was strictly limited to seeing their own body, and that alone. There was no furniture, there were no other people or anything in the room. But still, you could see how that could begin to explain things somewhat, though obviously not fully.
Of course.
Sabom interviewed a woman named Pam Reynolds who underwent brain surgery in 1991 with her eyes taped shut and molded and clicking inserts inside of her ears, which apparently is some way that they can read brain waves, but it was here to prevent her from hearing. I don't know why they didn't just put sound canceling headphones on her or something, but regardless. Despite these factors and the fact that her EEG was flat, meaning that all brain activity had ceased, as surgeons were repairing a massive aneurysm and had drained blood from her brain, she reported having seen the Midas Rex bone saw being used on her skull. She described it as I don't want to see that. She described it as a giant electric toothbrush, and its interchangeable attachments were kept in what looked like a socket wrench case, which was indeed incredibly accurate to a Midas Rex bone saw and the way that its attachments are kept. While a deaf and blind study would be the epitome of evidence in an NDE, no one has ever done one. Though psychology professor and international associate for near-death studies co-founder Kenneth Ring and psychology PhD Sharon Cooper contacted 11 organizations for the blind, explaining that they were searching for blind people who had near-death or out-of-body experiences. They ended up with 31 blind people who had near-death experiences, and of those, 24 of them reported being able to see during their experience.
Oh, wow.
Some saw their bodies lying below them. Some saw doctors or physical features of the room or building that they were in. And others saw deceased relatives. And this included people who had been blind since birth, people whose dreams almost never contain visual images, just sounds and tactile impressions. So it's kind of unexplainable. One woman had actually lost her sight due to terrible surgical complications and reported seeing both her lover and the father of her child in the hallway as they wheeled her into the emergency surgery after the incident took place where she was blinded. She had already lost her sight at that point, obviously, and when followed up with, her lover and the father of her child both confirmed that they had been standing in the hallway as they wheeled her gurney past them on the way to surgery. And who knows? She didn't give any, like, he was wearing this or he made this gesture, but it's possible that she saw them, you know, who knows? In one of the most compelling NDEs, a migrant worker named Maria had a heart attack while living in Seattle. Maria told her ICU social worker that she had not only watched herself being worked on in the ICU, but that she also drifted out of the building and over the parking lot. It was then that she noticed a tennis shoe on a ledge on the north end of the third floor building. Later that day, the ICU worker went up to the third floor and found a tennis shoe where Maria had reported seeing one. So, who knows?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yes. In 1977, a group of parapsychologists undertook the project of attempting to get an individual, one Stuart Harari, to be specific, a man who had experience in previous out-of-body experience projects at Duke University, and he was instructed to leave his body and travel to one of the rooms that they set up as a quote-unquote detection room, which was 50 feet or a quarter mile away. There were people
between 50 feet or a quarter mile away?
It was either 50 feet or a quarter mile. There was 2 detection rooms.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
There were people stationed in these detection rooms, and they were to attempt to sense Harari while he quote-unquote visited. The results were not great, as people sensed a presence just as many times when he wasn't astrally traveling to the room as when he claimed that he was. Mm-hmm. In the reports of the transcendental... Okay, and then also, they did this experiment with animals and trying to see if animals reacted to this man's astral travel into the room, and they also didn't give a shit. So, who knows? Who knows? In the reports of the transcendental environments that are seen or visited during NDEs, there seems to be 2 basic versions: in the sky or on the farm. There's either a place with a blue, sunny sky or clouds and mist, and then there's the other, which is like a heavenly garden or pastures, which definitely sounds like these people may be seeing something a little beyond our realm of comprehension, and then are placing our own preconceived thoughts of what heaven might be onto them, perhaps. Obviously, we have no idea what happens when we die. If there is some great place we all congregate to, or if we're reborn as ourselves in another dimension, or as someone new in our own dimension. Mm-hmm. If there's a place like heaven that exists, it's likely we will never access it while we are alive, as it is in some dimension far beyond ours, only accessible at death, or maybe in the rare case of a dimensional overlap. Dr. Grayson has begun, who we've spoken about many times during this episode, has begun to believe that cessation of the brain's everyday activities, as happens during clinical death, might enable the consciousness to tune in to a channel that's normally blocked or obscured by the chatter. He says it's almost as if the brain and its normal functioning stops you from going there, and when you knock those parts of the brain out, then you're able to access it. Are there possibly other ways to access this transcendental state which may or may not exist out there somewhere at all times? Research, personal and otherwise, but seriously, there are scientific studies on this, suggests that certain drugs do deliver experiences that can at times be nearly identical to near-death or out-of-body experiences. Ketamine, LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, DMT, and more all have a scientific community that is slowly but surely finding its way into research regarding near-death experiences, mental health treatment by way of microdosing, and in the more intangible ways, giving your brain a quote-unquote retuning to allow the experience of a different reality from the everyday world, which is, ladies and gents, anyone's reason for doing drugs in the first place.
Right, exactly.
But seriously, I am down to do some more personal research on this topic in the future, and I'll report back to you.
There's supposed to be a place, I think, in Kentucky where they do like ayahuasca retreats of some sort. My mom was telling me about it because she was suggesting for my anxiety
Yeah.
that I try to do something
Yeah, or
like that.
or like microdosing LSD or something might help, or MDMA or something might help you. That the ayahuasca thing, I think I watched a documentary where, and so this guy was like throwing up after he ate it, and
Yes.
the guy's like, get it out. That's because you're harboring negativity and stuff and this and that. So anyway,
Right.
it's interesting just the way that things are thought of. I don't know.
I did have a coworker who did ayahuasca, and she said it was an absolutely, like, she did ayahuasca, and then I guess they did I think we talked about it in the Black Eyed Kids episode, where she did like the frog poison too.
Oh, yeah.
Called kumba, and it left scars on her wrist. But she said it was the most life-changing experience. She let go of a lot of resentment that she was harboring.
That's good.
And I would that's something that I would love to do, like a retreat.
Yeah.
Anyways.
I've had some life-changing experiences doing MDMA on my own accord. Pure Land Buddhists, dating all the way back to AD 400, believe that by practicing certain extreme forms of meditation, it is possible to experience the same heaven-like place that people report in NDEs. One of the junior monks' duties was to sit at the bedside of dying elders and jot down their deathbed visions of the, quote, Pure Land. By the 11th century, there were over 100 accounts of this place. One of these extreme meditations is the, quote, constantly walking meditation practice, in which for 90 straight days you do not lie down, you don't stop walking even for a second until 3 months have elapsed. And yes, exhaustion may take your brain to some other wavelength, or they've been driven to hallucinations through exhaustion. I'm not sure.
Of course.
Heaven isn't the only place people who have NDEs or meditation-induced experiences go. Sometimes people report hearing screams and moans, violent scenes of torture by grotesque creatures, but these instances are incredibly rare, and according to the researchers that study these experiences, it is often suggested that it's a difference in attitude. So it's like if you go outside and you're like, it's a beautiful day today when it's raining, or you're like, fuck this, I'm pissed, I hate rain. They're saying that essentially you kind of make it what you want to subconsciously.
It's like a trip.
Yeah, exactly. And so we conclude this discussion of Spook Science Tackles the Afterlife. I think, as usual, we're left with just as many questions as answers, and when it comes down to it, we do not know what the hell goes on after we die, or where our energy and consciousness go, if anywhere. If you claim to be sure, chances are you're banking on faith, which is all we really have in this situation. I don't think science is able to fully answer any questions we have about whether there are other dimensions, who lives in them. Do we go there when we die, or do we go somewhere else? Are we the same person or someone new? Do we glean some magical knowledge at death that gives us all the answers that we crave our entire lives? We'll see. But until then, we'll keep digging to find out.
Thank you guys so much for listening to 3 hours of this, 2.5 hours of this episode. And if you would like to join our family, head on over to patreon.com/creepitrealpod. We do weekly Creepin' Up episodes, and we have sweet merch, and people are going to start receiving some sweet, sweet cards that are handcrafted by Ashley herself, and some other ones that I've designed that we have the first batch of that I need to send out. If you would like to support us in other ways, please feel free to share us with your family and friends. We would absolutely appreciate and love that. And head on over to iTunes.com and submit a 5-star written review. We do read them. And if you're a Spotify user, just hit that follow button.
And also, sadly, because I probably am dying, we have to postpone our Halloween party.
Yeah. It's okay. Just get better.
Okay. But thanks for listening, everybody. It's been real. Have a great life.
Have a great everything.
Creep it real.